Lillian Mercer's day had begun with an undeniable heaviness, an invisible weight pressing against her chest with each reluctant step she took. It was as though the universe itself had conspired against her, weaving a tapestry of minor inconveniences designed to test the limits of her endurance. The air in London was damp, carrying a bitter chill that clung to her skin, seeping through the fabric of her coat. The city, usually a muted symphony of life, felt more oppressive than ever. The streets hummed with their usual rhythm, cars honking, people brushing past in hurried strides, but Lillian felt detached, as if she were merely an observer to the chaos that unfolded around her. Her morning had been a sequence of unfortunate events, each one a drop in the rising tide of her frustration. The alarm on her phone had failed to wake her at the intended hour, robbing her of the precious time she needed to prepare for an important meeting. The coffee she had desperately needed had spilled across her sleeve, leaving a dark stain as an unwelcome reminder of her clumsiness. The train had been delayed, forcing her to stand among the throng of irritated commuters, their bodies pressing too close, their breaths mingling in the confined space. And then the email had come, its words slicing through her patience like a sharpened blade. It was from her superior, a condescending man whose every syllable reeked of entitlement. His message, though polite in tone, carried an undertone of dismissal, a veiled critique of her recent performance. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. No matter how much effort she poured into her work, no matter how tirelessly she fought for recognition in a world that refused to take her seriously, it all crumbled under the weight of the same tired excuses. "We appreciate your contributions, but we were expecting something more refined." That was the moment she had snapped. Not outwardly, not in a way that could be seen or measured, but something inside her had fractured. A raw, untamed anger bubbled up, pressing against the confines of her self-control. She wanted to scream. Lillian Mercer's day had begun with an undeniable heaviness, an invisible weight pressing against her chest with each reluctant step she took. It was as though the universe itself had conspired against her, weaving a tapestry of minor inconveniences designed to test the limits of her endurance. The air in London was damp, carrying a bitter chill that clung to her skin, seeping through the fabric of her coat. The city, usually a muted symphony of life, felt more oppressive than ever. The streets hummed with their usual rhythm, cars honking, people brushing past in hurried strides, but Lillian felt detached, as if she were merely an observer to the chaos that unfolded around her. Her morning had been a sequence of unfortunate events, each one a drop in the rising tide of her frustration. The alarm on her phone had failed to wake her at the intended hour, robbing her of the precious time she needed to prepare for an important meeting. The coffee she had desperately needed had spilled across her sleeve, leaving a dark stain as an unwelcome reminder of her clumsiness. The train had been delayed, forcing her to stand among the throng of irritated commuters, their bodies pressing too close, their breaths mingling in the confined space. And then the email had come, its words slicing through her patience like a sharpened blade. It was from her superior, a condescending man whose every syllable reeked of entitlement. His message, though polite in tone, carried an undertone of dismissal, a veiled critique of her recent performance. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. No matter how much effort she poured into her work, no matter how tirelessly she fought for recognition in a world that refused to take her seriously, it all crumbled under the weight of the same tired excuses. "We appreciate your contributions, but we were expecting something more refined." That was the moment she had snapped. Not outwardly, not in a way that could be seen or measured, but something inside her had fractured. A raw, untamed anger bubbled up, pressing against the confines of her self-control. She wanted to scream. She wanted to shatter the glass of the nearest shop window, to let the shards rain down like the broken expectations she had carried her entire life. But she didn't. Instead, she walked. Her boots struck the pavement with increasing force as she stormed through the streets, the cold biting at her exposed skin. She was aware of the people around her, but they were little more than ghosts drifting past, their presence insignificant in the vast sea of her frustration. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, nails digging into her palms. The world felt unfair, unjust, built to favor those who fit neatly within its rigid parameters, and she had spent too long being told she was too much, too opinionated, too passionate, too unwilling to conform. She hadn't intended to end up in front of Buckingham Palace. It wasn't a conscious decision, but rather a manifestation of the storm raging within her. And yet, there she stood, staring at the towering gates, the grandeur of the palace beyond them. It was a symbol of tradition, of power wielded by those who had never tasted the bitterness of struggle. A fortress built upon the backs of centuries of submission, upheld by the silent sentinels who stood guard, unyielding, unwavering. Her eyes settled on one of them, a single figure among the many, dressed in the familiar crimson uniform, his stance rigid, his face impassive. He was young, but not too young. His features were sharp, carved with an air of quiet resilience. There was something in the way he stood, in the way his gaze remained fixed ahead, refusing to acknowledge the world that existed beyond his duty. It was infuriating. Lillian felt the surge of defiance rise within her, an impulse born of a day spent being beaten down by an invisible hand. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. Why did they get to stand there, untouchable, unquestioned, while she had to claw her way through every moment of her existence? She wanted to break through the carefully constructed wall of indifference he had built around himself. She wanted him to react. A smirk curled at the edges of her lips as she stepped forward, her pulse thrumming with anticipation. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension, though he gave no indication that he even registered her presence. She moved closer, eyes narrowing. And then she struck. The sound of her fist connecting with his face was almost deafening in its clarity. A sharp, visceral collision of skin against skin, bone against bone. Gasps rippled through the crowd, a collective intake of breath as the cold wind swept through the streets of London like an invisible tide, carrying with it the scent of damp stone and the faint trace of petrol from the ever-moving traffic. The city was a machine, a relentless beast that never ceased its motion, consuming every soul who dared to exist within its bounds. Lillian Mercer walked without purpose, her steps heavy against the pavement, her mind a storm of noise that refused to quiet. She was adrift, untethered, her thoughts unraveling like frayed threads in the wind. Her pulse still throbbed in her ears from the confrontation at the cafe, from the sheer weight of a morning that had conspired against her. It wasn't just the coffee spilling across her coat, the delayed train, the suffocating press of bodies against her as she struggled to reach her destination. It was the email, the sterile, carefully composed message that told her, in words that pretended to be kind, that she had failed. Again, she could still hear her superior's voice in her head, though the words had only existed on a screen. "We appreciate your contributions, but we were expecting something more refined." How many times had she heard those same words? How many times had she pushed herself to the brink, only to be told that she wasn't quite enough? It was infuriating the way they smiled, the way they masked their condescension with carefully chosen phrases, all while expecting her to be grateful for the opportunity to prove herself over and over again. Lillian clenched her fists, her nails digging into the flesh of her palms. It wasn't fair. She had worked harder than anyone she knew. She had sacrificed sleep, sanity, relationships, everything for a chance to be recognized, to be taken seriously in a world that seemed determined to keep her at arm's length. And yet, here she was, unnoticed, unheard, just another woman expected to sit down, be quiet, and accept whatever scraps were thrown her way. The anger festered inside her, a simmering heat that refused to die down, no matter how many deep breaths she took. The world blurred at the edges as she walked, the towering buildings of London rising around her like silent sentinels. She barely registered the people she passed, their faces blending into an indistinct mass, their voices a dull murmur in the background of her thoughts. And then, as though drawn by some unseen force, her feet carried her to Buckingham Palace. It loomed before her, a symbol of power and tradition, of a world that had never truly welcomed people like her. The gates were high, black wrought iron laced with gold, a barrier between the common world and the untouchable elite that resided within. Beyond them, the palace stood in silent arrogance, its pristine facade unmarked by the struggles of those who lived outside its walls. And standing at attention before it, clad in their immaculate uniforms, were the guards. Lillian's breath hitched slightly, her anger momentarily shifting into something colder, something darker. The Royal Guard, pillars of discipline, of unwavering composure. Symbols of an institution that had stood for centuries, upheld by the belief that some people were simply born to rule, while others were born to serve. Her eyes locked onto one of them. He was tall, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable beneath the imposing black bearskin hat that obscured most of his features. The red of his uniform was stark against the gray sky, a splash of color in the otherwise muted landscape. He stood like a statue, unmoving, his gaze fixed straight ahead, as if the world beyond his duty did not exist. Something about him enraged her. The sheer stoicism, the way he refused to acknowledge anything beyond his assigned role. The way he stood there, unaffected, while the world burned around him. Lillian felt a bitter laugh rise in her throat. What must it be like to exist with such certainty, to wake up every morning knowing exactly what was expected of you, never having to fight for your place, never having to prove your worth? She took a step closer, then another. He did not move. A spark of something dangerous flickered in her mind. A test, a challenge. She stepped closer still, until she was barely a foot away, standing just within the invisible boundary that separated the tourists from the guards. The murmurs of onlookers rippled around her, but she ignored them. This wasn't about them. This was about him. Her head tilted slightly as she studied his face, searching for any sign of reaction. There was none. A smirk played at the corner of her lips. She raised a hand, waving it mockingly in front of his face. Nothing. She pulled a face, exaggerating a ridiculous expression, waiting for some flicker of amusement, irritation, anything, still nothing. The frustration coiled inside her like a tightening spring. "You're nothing but a glorified statue, aren't you?" She muttered, her voice low, her words meant only for him. He did not flinch. Something inside her snapped. Before she could stop herself, before she could even register what she was about to do, her hand shot forward. A sharp, deliberate flick of her fingers against his cheek. It was nothing. A tiny movement. A meaningless gesture. But it was enough. Because in that instant the world seemed to still. She had touched him. She had crossed the line, the unbreakable rule, and yet he had not moved. A thrill shot through her veins. Power. For the first time that day, she felt powerful. A rush of adrenaline flooded her senses, drowning out the noise, the doubt, the gnawing feeling of inadequacy that had plagued her all morning. She had made an impact. She had forced her presence into a space where it was not welcome. And then, before she could think, before she could even process the consequences, she did something truly reckless. Her hand curled into a fist, and she punched him. A sharp gasp rippled through the crowd, the sound of her knuckles colliding with his cheekbone, echoing in the tense silence. The world tilted for a fraction of a second, time slowing as the realization of what she had done settled into her bones. She had struck a royal guard. A flicker of motion, a breath of change in the air. And then he moved. It was not dramatic. It was not violent. It was controlled. A single step forward. A shift in posture. And before Lillian could react, before she could even comprehend what was happening, his hand closed around her wrist. Tight. Unyielding. The crowd erupted. Cameras were raised, voices rising in disbelief. But Lillian could not move. Because in that moment, as she looked up into the storm of his gaze, she realized something. She had spent all morning being pushed, being dismissed, being made to feel invisible. And now, for the first time all day, she had someone's full attention. The moment stretched endlessly, a breath suspended in time, thick with the weight of something irreversible. The world around them had not yet caught up with what had just happened, had not yet fully absorbed the audacity of it, the sheer impossibility of what had just transpired in the sacred stillness of Buckingham's gates. But soon it would swallow them whole. Lillian Mercer could feel the pulse hammering against her throat, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts as if her body were struggling to keep pace with the gravity of her own actions. The crowd surrounding them, once nothing more than a blur of faces, was now a living, breathing entity, a beast stirring awake, mouths agape, eyes widened in disbelief. The hum of murmurs swelled, the rustle of shifting feet, and the sharp metallic clicks of smartphones capturing the moment in pixels and compressed video files. Yet, amid the eruption of whispers and the collective shockwave of bystanders trying to reconcile what they had just witnessed, there was something else. Something that should not have been. Silence. It was in him, in the guard, in Thomas Ainsworth. Where there should have been outrage, a break in composure, a flicker of hesitation, there was none. He did not falter. He did not recoil. He did not react as he should have. Instead, he had moved with a precision so sharp it sliced through the moment like a blade, shifting effortlessly from unshakable sentinel to something else entirely. A force, a presence. His grip around her wrist had been swift, an instinct sharpened by years of conditioning, his fingers curling around her skin in an unrelenting hold. But it was not wild, not reckless. It was something far more dangerous than that. It was controlled. Lillian's heart pounded against her ribs as her mind struggled to process the sheer absurdity of what had just unfolded. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had spent her life mastering resistance, navigating every room with a well-practiced ability to provoke without consequence. It was a game she had learned to play from a young age, one that she had become fluent in, because people, no matter their position, always cracked. They reacted, they wavered, they betrayed their own control. But not him. Not this time. His face remained impassive, a marble sculpture carved by discipline itself, and yet, his eyes, they were not empty. They were not nothing. Beneath the carefully cultivated stillness, there was something else lurking there, something that unsettled her in a way she had not expected. It was not anger. It was not indignation. It was recognition. A slow, steady realization unfolded behind his gaze, as if he had seen this exact moment before, as if he knew, with complete and unshakable certainty, what came next. Lillian felt her breath catch, the air thick and unmoving in her lungs. The weight of the moment pressed against her, suffocating in its sheer magnitude. She wanted to pull back, to reclaim control of the situation, to laugh it off with some half-hearted quip that would diffuse the rising tension. But she couldn't, because he had done something she had not prepared for. He had acknowledged her, not as a faceless figure in a sea of people, not as an inconvenience to be ignored, but as a threat. And that terrified her. The shifting murmur of the crowd swelled around them, the energy turning volatile, electric with the anticipation of the moment tilting towards something else entirely. A voice broke through the fog, a sharp, startled exclamation from somewhere behind her. "Oh my God, did she just hit him?" And just like that, the reality of what she had done crashed down upon her. The tension in Thomas's grip did not falter. He did not crush her wrist, did not pull her forward, did not retaliate as he could have, but he did not let go. He did not release her. He simply held her there, an unspoken command pulsing between them. "Do you understand what you have done?" Lillian swallowed hard, her mind a mess of impulses pulling her in opposite directions. The fight in her screamed at her to break away, to challenge him, to turn this moment into a battle of wills. But something deeper, more primal, more instinctive told her to stay still. Because she was standing on the edge of something that she did not control. Something was shifting. The world had been one way only seconds ago. Now it was another, and she was at its mercy. The seconds stretched, long and excruciating, until another voice, more urgent this time. Somebody call the police. Lillian's stomach dropped. The realization hit her like a cold, unforgiving tide. She was not in control. Not anymore. For the first time in her entire life. She was not the one holding the power. The world had changed. It was an imperceptible shift at first, a slow unraveling of reality, like the first cracks forming beneath the weight of something too heavy to be contained. Lillian Mercer felt it in the air, in the way the atmosphere around her had thickened, pressing against her skin with an almost physical weight. The onlookers, once distant figures in the periphery of her mind, had transformed into something else entirely. They were no longer passive observers, no longer just bystanders to an incident they would soon forget. They were witnesses now. And that changed everything. The murmurs had turned into whispers, and the whispers into something sharper. Accusations. The tension hung in the air like a string pulled too tight, vibrating with the force of unspoken judgments, of assumptions that had already been made in the span of mere seconds. She could feel their eyes on her, burning, digging, dissecting her like a specimen under a magnifying glass. Some of them had already chosen sides. Others were still waiting, watching, their verdict yet to be delivered. But there was no mistaking it. This moment, this singular moment, was no longer in her hands. Lillian's breath came in shallow bursts, her pulse an erratic drumbeat in her ears. She had spent her entire life navigating the nuances of control, of carefully curating her responses, her actions, her words, so that no one else would ever have the upper hand. But now, she was trapped inside a moment that had slipped from her grasp entirely. The guard, Thomas Ainsworth, had not released her. His grip was still firm around her wrist, but it was not crushing, not violent. There was no malice in his hold. Just restraint. Just unyielding authority. Just something that had been decided long before she had even realized what she had done. Asterisk, asterisk. She wanted to pull away, to reclaim the space that had always been hers, to demand that he let her go. But the moment she moved, the moment she even considered resistance, the murmurs in the crowd grew louder. She hit him. I saw it. She actually punched him. Did you see how hard she went at him? What the hell was she thinking? She's lucky he didn't knock her straight to the ground. The words slashed through her composure, sharp as broken glass. Lillian's stomach dropped, a heavy, twisting weight sinking deep into the pit of her being. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had expected silence, expected indifference. She had expected him, the immovable, unshakable symbol of the monarchy, to simply absorb her defiance like an ocean swallowing a stone. She had expected him to do nothing. But he had done something. And now, so had everyone else. From somewhere within the growing chaos, a voice cut through the noise like a blade. Police. Call the police. A ripple went through the crowd. A shift in energy. A turn. Lillian felt it in her bones before she even fully understood what it meant. A new fear slithered into her chest, cold and suffocating, curling around her ribs like an iron vice. This wasn't just a spectacle anymore. This wasn't just some reckless act of defiance that would be forgotten by the time she walked away. This was something else. Something dangerous. Something irreversible. Her eyes darted around searching, asterisk, asterisk, for an exit, for an ally, for some crack and moment where she could slip through and escape whatever came next, asterisk, asterisk, but there was none. Because she had not just struck a man. She had struck a guard of the Queen. And that meant there was no easy way out. The air around her became unbearably thick. The crowd felt closer than before, the weight of their stares pressing against her skin like 100 invisible hands. She wanted to move, to shake them off, to breathe, but it was too late for that now. A sharp voice pierced through the gathering storm. Step back. The command rang out, unmistakable in its authority. And then, asterisk, asterisk movement, asterisk, asterisk. Two figures in dark uniforms cut through the crowd like wolves moving through tall grass, their presence sending a fresh wave of silence rippling through the spectators. Lillian knew what they were before they even reached her. The Metropolitan Police. Her pulse spiked, her body going rigid. No. This was not how it was supposed to happen. One of the officers, tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes like granite, assessed the scene in an instant. His gaze flickered between Lillian and the guard still holding her wrist. His face remained unreadable, but Lillian could feel the weight of his scrutiny pressing down on her like an anvil. And then he spoke. What happened here? The words were calm, measured, but they carried weight. For the first time since it had happened, Thomas moved. It was subtle, just a shift, just a recalibration of his stance, but it was enough. Enough to change everything. And when he finally spoke, when his voice emerged steady, composed, cold, it did not bring relief. It brought judgment. She assaulted me, he said. Clear. Unwavering. Final, asterisk, asterisk. The words hit like a sledgehammer. The officer's gaze snapped to Lillian, sharp and expectant. Waiting. Waiting for her to say something. Waiting for her to justify the unjustifiable. But there was no explanation that could undo what had already been done. No words that could rewrite the evidence standing right in front of them. Lillian felt her throat close. This was it. The beginning of the fall, and she knew it. The air had turned heavy, thick with something that cannot be seen, but was deeply felt. It pressed down on Lillian Mercer's chest like an invisible weight, wrapping around her lungs, squeezing the breath from them before she could even inhale. The voices, the cameras, the murmurs, they all blurred into a low, ceaseless hum in the background, a sickening reminder that she was not alone in this moment. The world was watching, and she was losing control. Her body felt rigid, frozen between fight and flight, yet neither response would save her now. She could hear the distinct clicks of shutters, the tiny red lights blinking on phone screens, capturing every single second of what was unfolding. This moment, this humiliating, unraveling moment, was no longer just hers to bear. It belonged to everyone who had stopped to watch, everyone who would see it online, dissect it, discuss it, and judge it. And in the center of it all, he stood. Thomas Ainsworth, still unshaken. Still unmovable, still holding her wrist. His presence was a wall, an unyielding force she had not anticipated. No anger flashed in his eyes, no smug satisfaction at her predicament. That would have been easier. Instead, his expression remained unreadable, his jaw set in stone, his eyes locked onto the officer now standing between them. "She assaulted me." The words had come clean, sharp, like a blade cutting through the thick air. There was no embellishment, no hesitation, no need for further clarification. They were as straightforward as the laws governing this very ground. A statement of fact that did not require interpretation. Lillian's chest tightened. The police officer standing before them gave a measured nod, his sharp blue eyes shifting between them as he pulled out a small notebook from his vest. There was something unnerving in his lack of reaction, as if this was just another day, another name in a report, another footnote in a long list of incidents. "Name." The officer's voice was steady, clipped. Lillian's mouth went dry. Her name. Her name. The very thing that defined her. The name that carried the weight of everything she had fought for, every stance she had taken, every battle she had waged against a world that refused to take her seriously. If she spoke it aloud, it would be recorded. It would be permanent. She could already hear the headlines writing themselves. The internet had no mercy. The fall from grace was always the hardest. Before she could force her voice to function, the officer turned his gaze to Thomas instead. "And you?" Lillian swallowed. She had never even considered what his name might be. But Thomas did not hesitate. "Thomas Ainsworth," he answered, his voice even controlled. The officer scribbled it down. The act of writing it down made it real in a way that sent another jolt of panic up Lillian's spine. This wasn't going to be swept aside. It wasn't just an exchange of heated words, a confrontation that would dissolve into the background noise of the city. This was something bigger. The tension in her wrist where Thomas still held her had not changed. He wasn't holding her there to inflict control over her. Asterisk, asterisk, he was waiting. Asterisk, asterisk, holding her steady until they decided what happened next. Lillian could feel her heartbeat in her throat, a rapid, erratic pulse that refused to settle. She needed to speak. She needed to say something, anything, to tip this moment back in her favor. But before she could, the officer turned to her again, pen poised over the page. "Miss, I'll ask again. Your name." It was happening too fast. Lillian hesitated a fraction of a second too long. And that was when another voice, one from within the crowd, asterisk, asterisk, rose above the others, asterisk, asterisk. "I got it on video." The moment snapped into sharp, brutal focus. A shift. A turn of irreversibility. Lillian's stomach dropped. She twisted her head toward the sound, her eyes locking onto a middle-aged man holding up his phone. The screen still displayed the image of her fist colliding with Thomas's face. Undeniable. 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 The officer turned toward the man, stepping away from Lillian and Thomas just long enough to assess the evidence. Lillian felt the breath she had been holding crash out of her chest. This was it. The officer's lips pressed into a thin line as he examined the screen, nodding slightly before looking back at her. "All right," he said, slipping his notebook back into his vest. "That's enough for now." Lillian's body stiffened. She had spent her life fighting, against dismissal, against injustice, against the ever-present weight of expectations, but now, she was no longer fighting for power. She was fighting to keep from losing everything. The officer reached for his radio, his tone matter-of-fact. "We need transport for one female suspect." The words did not make sense. Transport. Suspect. A new foreign terror gripped her. The very notion of consequences was something she had always been able to outrun, outmaneuver, outtalk. But she could not outrun this, because this was not a battle of words. This was real. The silence stretched long enough for her ears to start ringing. She had not realized Thomas had finally released her wrist until she saw the faint imprint of his grip still there, stark against her pale skin. The weight of everything threatened to crush her. And then asterisk, asterisk, a new sound, asterisk, asterisk. Distant sirens. Growing closer. Lillian's stomach twisted into a knot, so tight she thought she might be sick. This was really happening. The fall had begun, and there was no way to stop it now. The wailing sirens cut through the thick London air, a sound that sent shivers crawling down Lillian Mercer's spine. They weren't just noise anymore. They weren't just some distant, impersonal echo of the city's constant hum of chaos. They were coming for her. The weight of reality settled upon her chest like an iron slab. It was suffocating, pressing into her ribs, refusing to let her breathe properly. She had spent so long believing she was untouchable, that she had control over the world around her, that she could bend it to her will with enough force, enough words, enough resistance. But the universe had its own way of balancing things, of delivering consequences when one least expected them. And now, she was standing on the very precipice of those consequences, asterisk asterisk, helpless to stop the fall, asterisk asterisk. The crowd had grown. The murmurs had shifted into something more solid, more decisive. Some faces held amusement, others contempt, and a few even held a twisted sort of satisfaction, the kind that came when witnessing the downfall of someone who thought themselves above the rules. The whisper of karma played in the background, woven into the judgmental glances and the click of recording phones. Lillian felt her stomach churn. She had always been in control of the narrative. She knew how to steer conversations, how to craft arguments, how to manipulate perception. But this was different. She could feel it. She wasn't steering anything anymore. She was caught inside a moment that was bigger than her, spinning beyond her grasp. The officer in front of her had his radio pressed to his shoulder, his voice calm, professional, unaffected. Asterisk asterisk, as if this were nothing more than another routine arrest, asterisk asterisk, another face in the system. Another name on a document. Lillian Mercer, reduced to just another name on a document. No, she refused that reality. Her throat felt tight as she fought to push back the rising panic, to reassert herself, to reclaim some fragment of the control slipping through her fingers. "This is ridiculous," she finally snapped, her voice sharp, edged with an anger that barely masked the desperation curling in her gut. This is being blown out of proportion. Are you really arresting me for this?" The officer didn't even look at her as he murmured something into his radio before returning his attention to her. "You assaulted a member of the Royal Guard," he said simply. Not a question, not an accusation. A statement of fact, asterisk asterisk. Lillian's heart slammed against her ribs. The words sounded so final. A sinking feeling coiled around her ribs, tightening, squeezing. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This wasn't just something she could talk her way out of. It was real. A flicker of movement caught her attention, and for the briefest second, her gaze was drawn to Thomas Ainsworth. He hadn't moved. Not since his statement. Not since those 3 words had sealed her fate. He had returned to his position, back straight, shoulders squared, his face unreadable once more. As if none of this had ever happened. As if she were beneath his concern. That, more than anything, sent a fresh wave of fury crashing through her veins. Because that meant she no longer mattered. She was no longer even worth acknowledging. And wasn't that the worst punishment of all? To be dismissed. To be insignificant. The blue and white lights of the approaching police vehicle flooded her peripheral vision, and the finality of it hit her like a blow to the chest. She had spent her whole life fighting against being silenced. And now for the first time, she had nothing left to say. The inside of the police van was cold, colder than Lillian had anticipated. The rigid steel beneath her hands, the unyielding bench pressing into her back, the sterile scent of reinforced plastic and lingering sweat, all of it conspired to suffocate her. The hum of the city, once a distant and impersonal backdrop, was now nothing more than a dull vibration beyond the metal walls that now contained her. She had been in tight spaces before. In crowded lifts, in packed tube stations where bodies pressed against her own, in rooms filled with powerful men who had dismissed her before she even spoke. But this was different. This was not just a space. It was a cage. Her wrists were still stinging from the snap of the cold steel cuffs, though they had been removed once she was inside. A procedural kindness, nothing more. She could feel the faint indentation where the metal had bitten into her skin, a dull reminder of what had just happened, of what was still happening. She tried to straighten her back, to reclaim some sense of dignity, but the very act of sitting in this space, behind this door, robbed her of it. This was not where she belonged. Not here. Not like this. Her breath came slow, measured. She refused to let it quicken, refused to allow even the smallest crack to form in the image she had spent a lifetime crafting. Lillian Mercer was not weak. She was not afraid. And yet there was a hollowness creeping in, settling into the spaces between her ribs, whispering to her that this moment was not temporary, that it would not simply pass. The weight of the situation was beginning to sink in, layer by layer, pressing against her skin like the slow pull of an undertow. She had seen the way they had looked at her. The crowd. The officer. Thomas Ainsworth. She had watched the shift in their expressions, the subtle tilt from shock to judgment, from curiosity to something colder. They weren't seeing a woman who had acted out of impulse. They weren't seeing a moment of frustration. They were seeing something else entirely. A spectacle. A mistake. A villain. Her jaw tightened, and she forced herself to look down at her hands, as if they would somehow hold the answers to the storm unraveling around her. But all she saw were her own trembling fingers. She curled them into fists. No, she would not let them take this from her. Her reputation, her beliefs, her fight, asterisk, asterisk, those belonged to her, asterisk, asterisk. Not to them. Not to the headlines. Not to the strangers outside who were already turning this moment into something else entirely. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, willing the rising tide of panic back into the depths of her mind. She just needed to breathe. And then, from beyond the reinforced doors, she heard it. The first headline. It came from somewhere in the distance, a voice crackling from a car radio or perhaps a bystander's phone. Feminist arrested after assaulting Royal Guard outside Buckingham Palace. Lillian felt her stomach drop. The first headline. The first narrative. And it was already out of her hands. She exhaled, slow and unsteady. She had been demonized before. She had endured backlash, scrutiny, mockery. But this time it felt different. Because this time, she wasn't walking away from the argument. She was being driven away in the back of a police van. The weight of it settled over her, cold and unrelenting. She had always fought for justice. But now, the world was seeing her as something else. And she was beginning to wonder if there was anything she could do to stop it. The cell was colder than she had imagined. Not in the way of temperature alone, but in the way emptiness could feel colder than any winter night. The walls were gray, lifeless, constructed not just to contain, but to erase, as if those who passed through here ceased to be people, as if they were stripped down to nothing but cases, files, paperwork. Lillian Mercer sat on a hard metal bench, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, though not from the cold. She wasn't shaking. Not outwardly. She wouldn't give them that, but inside, something unfamiliar was beginning to take root. Something heavy. Something unshakable. The sound of the metal bars locking behind her had echoed in her mind for minutes, perhaps hours. She couldn't tell anymore. Time had a way of bending in places like this, stretching between breaths, making seconds feel like lifetimes. Her wrists still ached from the cuffs, phantom pressure lingering in the soft skin, a silent brand of everything she had just endured. The processing had been efficient, methodical, like an assembly line. Her name had been written down, her fingerprints pressed into ink, her belongings confiscated, tucked into a plastic bag as though she were no longer entitled to them. The officer who had led her inside barely looked at her. That had been the worst part. Not the cold, not the fear that clawed at the edges of her mind, not even the looming uncertainty of what would happen next. It was the indifference, the way they had barely regarded her at all, like she was nothing more than a formality, a process, a name on a file that would be shuffled into the great, endless bureaucracy of the system. She had spent her whole life fighting to be seen, to be heard. And now, in this place, in this brutal, sterile silence, she was facing something worse than opposition. She was invisible. She exhaled slowly, pressing her palms against the cold bench, grounding herself in the sensation. Think, Lillian. Think, asterisk, asterisk. She needed to regain her footing, needed to understand how to turn this moment into something she could control. But how? The world outside was already spinning without her. She could see it now. Asterisk, asterisk, the headlines, the debates, the endless commentary. Asterisk, asterisk. She had lost the ability to shape the narrative the moment the police then had driven away from Buckingham Palace. Now she was the story, and she had no say in how it was being told. A bitter taste rose in her throat. Was this how it felt? To be powerless? To have the world decide what you were before you could even open your mouth? She had always thought she understood that struggle. She had built her entire life around the idea that she was fighting against it, pushing back against the forces that silence voices like hers. But now, asterisk, asterisk, now she wondered, asterisk, asterisk. Had she ever really known what it felt like to have something taken from her like this? To have her own actions spiral so far beyond her grasp that nothing she said, nothing she did, would change what happened next? Her fingers curled into fists. She needed a way out, not just physically. She needed to reclaim herself before this place stripped her down into something she did not recognize. The sound of approaching footsteps made her sit up straighter. Someone was coming. She knew better than to hope. Hope was a luxury in a place like this, and she wasn't sure she could afford luxuries anymore. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor, sharp against the sterile hush of the holding cell. The air was thick with something unspoken, something oppressive that wrapped itself around the walls, pressing against the ceiling, slithering through the cold metal bars. Lillian Mercer sat motionless on the unforgiving bench, her back straight, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap. She would not let them see her tremble. The silence had been her only companion for what felt like a lifetime, stretching the seconds into something unbearable. There was no window in the small, dimly lit cell. No indication of time passing. Just the blank, gray walls and the weight of consequence settling into her bones. But now there was movement. A key slid into the lock, twisting with an audible click that sent a shiver down her spine. The door groaned open, and light from a corridor spilled into the confined space, slicing through the dimness like a scalpel. A uniformed officer stepped inside. "Stand up." His voice was firm, devoid of emotion, the kind that came from years of dealing with people like her, people who had made mistakes, people who had crossed lines. For a fleeting second, Lillian wanted to refuse. To remain seated as an act of defiance, to reclaim some fraction of power in a moment that had taken everything from her. But she hesitated too long, and that was already a loss. She rose slowly, her limbs stiff from hours of stillness. The officer's gaze flickered over her, but there was no curiosity in it, no interest. Just duty. "You have a visitor." Her breath hitched, a sharp, involuntary reaction. A visitor. 100 possibilities flashed through her mind, each one more absurd than the last. A lawyer? No, she hadn't contacted one. A friend? Doubtful. Most of her allies existed in the digital sphere, people who would tweet in her defense but would never set foot in a place like this. Then a darker thought slithered in. What if it was someone coming to ensure she understood exactly how much trouble she was in? Her throat felt tight, dry. But she nodded, stepping forward. The officer led her out, the heavy metal door slamming shut behind her with a finality that rattled through her skull. Each step she took down the corridor felt heavier than the last. The polished linoleum reflected the overhead lights in a way that made the world seem almost distorted, unreal, as though she were walking through a dream that had turned into a nightmare. Then they reached it. A small enclosed room. A single metal table, 2 chairs, separated by a pane of glass. And on the other side, him. Lillian's breath caught. Thomas Ainsworth. He sat with the same unshakable stillness he had held outside Buckingham Palace, his back straight, hands folded in front of him, his expression as unreadable as ever. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Lillian felt something cold slither down her spine. This wasn't a coincidence. He wasn't here out of curiosity. He had come with purpose. The officer gestured to the chair on her side of the glass. "Sit." She did. Slowly. The chair was uncomfortable, but she hardly noticed. Her entire focus was on him. For the first time since the incident, since everything, she was looking directly into his eyes without the weight of a crowd pressing in around them. And what she saw there made her stomach turn. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was calculated observation. He was studying her. Lillian swallowed against the dryness in her throat. "Why are you here?" she finally asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Thomas didn't answer immediately. Then, after what felt like eternity, he leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. "You tell me," he said. Lillian's fingers curled against the cold metal of the table. This was a game. But was a game she didn't know the rules to anymore. And she had the sinking feeling that he did. The silence between them stretched long and unbroken, heavy like the air before a storm. Lillian Mercer sat rigid in her chair, her hands clasped tightly together beneath the steel table, her fingers cold against her own skin. Across from her, Thomas Ainsworth remained eerily composed, his sharp blue eyes locked onto hers, unwavering, unblinking, as if he were trying to unravel her from the inside out. She had always prided herself on her ability to read people, to detect the smallest flicker of emotion, the minutest crack in their armor. But as she sat there, face to face with the man she had struck only hours ago, she found nothing in his gaze. No satisfaction, no anger, no resentment. And that, asterisk, asterisk, that was worse than anything else, asterisk, asterisk, because it meant she had no control over this moment. Her entire world had spun off its axis since the instant she threw that punch. The incident had been seized by the media, dissected by the public, twisted into something bigger than herself. And now she was here, stripped of everything but the weight of her own choices, waiting for a man she barely knew to decide what happened next. The overhead light buzzed faintly, casting harsh shadows against the white walls. The small, sterile interrogation room smelled of bleach and bureaucracy, the scent of government-issued carpet and old paper. It was the kind of room where decisions were made without emotion, without sympathy. Lillian hated it. She had spent years building herself into someone who could not be ignored. She had pushed, clawed, fought to make sure her voice was heard in every room she entered. And now, for the first time, she had nothing to say. The weight of that realization made her stomach churn. She exhaled slowly, carefully. If you came here to watch me break, you'll be waiting a long time. Ainsworth didn't react. He just sat there, his hands folded neatly on the table, his expression impassive. But something in the air shifted, a subtle crackle of tension that wasn't there before. Then, finally, he spoke. "I don't need to watch," he said calmly. "You already have." Lillian's chest tightened. His words weren't spoken cruelly, nor were they meant to humiliate. But somehow, they cut deeper than any insult could. She straightened her back, forcing herself to hold his gaze, though it felt like staring into a mirror that reflected only her own mistakes. "I don't regret what I did," she said, and to her own surprise, her voice didn't waver. Ainsworth studied her for a long moment, his head tilting ever so slightly. "Then why do you look like someone who does?" Lillian's pulse spiked. There it was. The truth she didn't want to face. She had spent so long believing she was on the right side of history, that her anger was justified, that every act of defiance was a necessary push against a world that refused to change. But what had it gotten her? A holding cell, a reputation in ruins, a moment she couldn't take back, no matter how badly she wanted to. And yet, she couldn't give him that victory. She wouldn't. Her expression hardened. "You have no idea who I am. You don't get to sit there and pretend you understand me." Ainsworth's lips barely parted, but the smallest breath of amusement flickered behind his eyes. Not mockery, something quieter, something unreadable, "You think I don't." Lillian's jaw clenched. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to throw the accusation at him, to tell him he was just another pawn in a system that had been built to silence people like her. But then, he leaned forward, not in a way that was threatening, not in a way that suggested power, but in a way that suggested truth. "I know exactly who you are," he said, his voice softer now, less rigid, yet somehow heavier. "You think you're fighting a war, but you've spent so much time swinging that you've forgotten to ask yourself who the real enemy is." Lillian's throat felt tight. She had expected condemnation. She had expected judgment. She hadn't expected this. And she didn't know which was worse. The seconds ticked by, stretching between them, filling the space with an unspoken challenge. Lillian could feel it, the way the moment demanded something from her. An answer. A response. But all she could hear were the echoes of her own past crashing down around her. The air in the courtroom felt thick, dense with the weight of scrutiny, the silent hum of judgment pressing against the walls like an invisible force. It wasn't the kind of silence that existed in peace. It was the anticipatory stillness before something inevitable, like standing at the edge of a cliff just before the fall. Lillian Mercer sat at the defendant's table, her hands clasped together tightly in her lap, her knuckles pale from the pressure. She could feel the gaze of the courtroom on her, a sea of unfamiliar faces, each of them hungry for something. A spectacle, a downfall, a resolution. She wasn't sure which one was worse. The judge sat high above them, his expression unreadable, his robe a heavy drape of authority. The polished wood of the bench gleamed under the artificial lights, a stark contrast to the cold, detached nature of the proceedings. Everything about this place was designed to make people feel small. And for the first time in her life, Lillian did. Her name had been spoken a dozen times already. Lillian Mercer, the defendant, the accused, the woman at the center of the storm. It echoed across the chamber like a bell tolling, a name she no longer recognized, a name that had become something separate from her, something owned by the media, the public, the relentless churn of headlines. Her face was on every screen. Her actions were on every news feed. And now, she was no longer the one telling her own story. The prosecution had laid out their argument with surgical precision, picking apart every second of that moment outside Buckingham Palace, dissecting it piece by piece until there was nothing left but the raw, inescapable truth. She had hit him. The video footage was undeniable. The clip had played across the courtroom screen, her arms swinging through the air, her fist connecting with Thomas Ainsworth's face in a movement that now seemed alien to her. Had it really been her? Had she truly done that? It felt like watching someone else, someone who had lost control, someone driven by impulse rather than reason. And yet, there was no excuse that could undo what had been done. No words that could make the impact disappear. The prosecution's voice was a low hum in her ears, a monotone recitation of the charges, the evidence, the consequences, but Lillian barely heard them. Her mind was lost in the weight of something deeper, something that could not be argued against. For the first time since this nightmare began, she was beginning to understand. This wasn't about defending herself anymore. This wasn't about winning. This was about accepting that she had lost. She had spent her whole life fighting battles, pushing against the system, railing against every injustice she saw in the world. But in doing so, had she become blind to the weight of her own actions? Had she convinced herself that every fight was justified, that every act of defiance was necessary? Had she been so caught up in the idea of pushing back that she had stopped asking herself why she was pushing in the first place? Her pulse pounded in her ears, loud and relentless. She could feel the eyes of the jury on her, the weight of Ainsworth's presence somewhere behind her. She hadn't dared to turn around since entering the courtroom. She couldn't, because she wasn't ready to face the question his presence demanded. Was she sorry? The thought made her stomach twist. She had spent so much time resisting regret, rejecting it outright as a weakness, as something that diluted the strength of her convictions. But now, as she sat there, listening to strangers decide her fate, she wasn't sure what she believed anymore. And that asterisk that terrified her more than anything else, asterisk. The sound of her own breath filled her ears, shallow and uneven. The judge's voice cut through the silence, deep and steady. Does the defense have anything to say before we proceed? Lillian felt every muscle in her body tense. This was it, her moment. Her last chance to speak before the decision was made, before the final stroke of the gavel sealed her fate in stone. And yet, asterisk, she hesitated, asterisk, because for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she had anything to say, or if it even mattered anymore. The courtroom was a vacuum, not silent, but suffocating in a different way, in the way that a room filled with too many people, too many expectations, and too many unspoken conclusions could smother a person before they even spoke. Lillian Mercer sat at the defendant's table, her hands resting on the polished wood, her nails pressing into the surface as if she could ground herself against the gravity of what was happening. The murmurs had died down now. The air held weight, thick with the kind of anticipation that came when justice, or what people believed to be justice, was about to be served. And she, asterisk, she was the one waiting to be sentenced, asterisk. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, piercing, judging, analyzing, asterisk. Every person in this courtroom had already decided who she was. To them, she was not a woman who had acted in a moment of unchecked emotion. She was not someone who had stumbled under the pressure of a day that had already worn her down to her breaking point. She was not someone human. She was a symbol, a headline, a representation of everything wrong with the world, depending on who you asked. And the most terrifying part? She had no control over which version of her they believed. Her heartbeat was slow, deliberate, each pulse reverberating in her ears as she stared ahead at the judge, whose face held no emotion, whose words would soon become the only words that mattered. Somewhere behind her, Thomas Ainsworth sat. She hadn't turned around. She couldn't. She had felt his presence the moment she walked into the room, had felt the cold, unwavering force of him watching her, but she had not once gathered the courage to look at him, because she knew what she would find. Not anger, not revenge, but something worse, something resembling pity. Lillian clenched her jaw. No, she would not be pitied. She would not sit here and let them strip her of everything she had fought for, everything she had stood for. But then the voice of the prosecutor rang out again, tearing through her thoughts. A screen flickered to life. And then, asterisk, the video, asterisk. Again. The one she had seen a dozen times already, the one that had played on news channels, on social media, on every screen in every home where people wanted to watch her downfall, in high definition. There she was, her arm swinging, her fist connecting. Freeze frame. Her face locked in an expression of fury, captured forever in that moment. The world had not let her move past it. And now neither could she. She swallowed hard, but her throat felt raw, as if she had been screaming in her sleep and hadn't realized. The prosecution continued, their voice even rehearsed. This, a motion to the screen. This is not a woman caught in the heat of a moment. This is an attack, and in this country, we do not tolerate attacks on those who serve, on those who dedicate their lives to duty. Lillian forced herself to breathe. She had expected this, had known it was coming, but knowing and feeling it happen were two different things. And yet, what stunned her the most wasn't the evidence, or the words, or the room filled with people waiting to watch her fall. It was what came next. The defense stood, and so did he. Thomas Ainsworth. The room shifted, asterisk, asterisk, a collective inhale, asterisk, asterisk. Lillian's spine went rigid. She finally turned, finally looked at him. And the moment their eyes met, she felt something inside her fracture. Because Thomas, asterisk, asterisk, the very man she had struck, the very reason she was sitting here today, was about to speak, asterisk, asterisk. And whatever he was about to say had the power to decide everything. The courtroom had never felt this quiet before. It wasn't silence, asterisk, asterisk, not truly, asterisk, asterisk, the air still buzzed with attention that hung thick between walls, pressing down on every single person in that room, but no one spoke. Because he was standing now. Thomas Ainsworth. The very man at the center of it all. The one who had taken the hit and never reacted. The one who had stood there, unwavering, unflinching, unshaken, as she had swung at him with all the fury of a storm. And now he was going to speak. Lillian Mercer's pulse pounded against her ribs, her breath coming in slow, measured inhales, but no amount of control could stop the sudden tightness in her throat. She should have known this moment was coming. But knowing and facing it were two entirely different things. Thomas stepped forward. His presence wasn't loud, but it carried weight. The weight of discipline, of command, of a man who had spent his entire life following a set of rules that had never been allowed to bend. And yet, asterisk, asterisk here, he was asterisk, asterisk. The judge nodded, acknowledging him. Sergeant Ainsworth, you may proceed. His voice, when it came, was calm, controlled, exactly as she had expected, asterisk, asterisk. But the words were not what she had prepared for. I do not believe Lillian Mercer deserves imprisonment. The room shifted. It wasn't just the collective inhalation of the crowd, nor the way the prosecution visibly stiffened at his words. It was more than that. It was the fundamental, irreversible breaking of the narrative. Because the very man who had every right to condemn her, the man whose face had been the target of her anger, the man whose uniform she had struck with all the force of her frustration, was not asking for punishment. He was challenging it. Lillian's hands clenched against her lap, her nails biting into her palms. She wasn't sure what to feel. Ainsworth continued, his voice unwavering, his gaze locked onto the judge. I understand the gravity of the situation. I understand the law, and I respect it. A small pause. But I also understand human nature, and I do not believe that what happened outside Buckingham Palace was an attack in the way this court suggests. Lillian felt the world tilt. Her entire body was tuned into him now. Because he wasn't speaking with cold detachment. He wasn't reading from a script. There was conviction behind his words. A conviction that was somehow worse than anger. Because anger was simple. This was something else entirely. Ainsworth turned his head just slightly, just enough that for the first time since this trial had begun, asterisk, asterisk, he looked directly at her, asterisk, asterisk. And in his expression, there was no hatred, no smugness, no satisfaction in watching her squirm. Only something she couldn't quite name, something she didn't know how to handle. The room had fallen into a stunned silence. And Lillian Mercer, for the first time in her life, had no idea what was going to happen next. The weight of the room shifted. It was subtle, imperceptible to most, but Lillian Mercer felt it. She felt it in the way the silence became something more than just an absence of sound. It became expectation, a pause pregnant with the weight of something irreversible. The courtroom, once a cacophony of voices, had stilled into a void where the next words spoken would define everything. She could hear the rhythmic pounding of her own heart, feel the faint tremor in her fingers as they curled against her lap. Every muscle in her body was wound tight, as though she were bracing for an impact she couldn't quite predict. She had spent years learning how to read rooms, how to navigate conflicts, how to wield words like weapons. But now, for the first time, she had no script. Because the narrative, the one that had been built around her since the moment her fist connected with Thomas Ainsworth's face, was crumbling. He was standing. He had spoken. And in doing so, he had unmade everything. Thomas Ainsworth, the man she had been told was her adversary, the one whose silence had condemned her more than any courtroom ever could, had just broken that silence. And not in the way anyone had expected. Her eyes were locked onto his, but his gaze was elsewhere. Directed at the judge, at the jury, at the people in the room who had come here expecting to see a villain punished, a criminal fall. But now there was uncertainty. Lillian could feel it radiating off the people behind her, the spectators who had filled this room with the singular desire to witness justice, or perhaps something far darker. They wanted a reckoning, a public example of what happened when someone stepped out of line. And yet, here stood the man she had wronged, refusing to give it to them. Ainsworth's voice was calm, measured, as though he had rehearsed this moment 100 times in his mind before stepping forward. "I am not here to ask for punishment," he said. "I am here to ask for perspective." The room shifted again. The judge's expression remained impassive, but there was a flicker of something beneath the surface. The prosecution's tight posture had stiffened further, like a bowstring drawn too tight, one breath away from snapping. And Lillian, Lillian could barely breathe at all, because she had expected condemnation. She had prepared for it. She had steeled herself against the inevitability of falling, had accepted that this moment would be the one where the world closed its hands around her and refused to let go. But this was not what she had prepared for. Ainsworth's gaze finally met hers. For the briefest moment, the world shrank. The courtroom, the judge, the jury, the prosecution, they all disappeared, There was just him. And the look in his eyes was not anger. It was not pity. It was something deeper, something older. Something that made her stomach tighten and her breath hitch. Something she didn't know how to fight. Because how do you fight against someone who refuses to be your enemy? The moment stretched long enough to become unbearable. Then, without another word, he turned back to the judge. And the weight of what was about to happen next crashed down around her. Because this wasn't over. Not yet. The courtroom had been emptied. The verdict had been read. The voices that once filled the space, echoing off the high ceilings with judgment, whispers, and tension, had faded into nothingness. The wooden benches, once occupied by onlookers hungry for spectacle, were now abandoned, leaving only dust particles dancing in the slivers of pale light that cut through the narrow windows. Lillian Mercer stood alone. She had been told she was free to leave. The doors were open. The outside world awaited, a city that had already decided what it thought of her, a world that had watched her unravel and fall, and now had no use for her anymore. But she didn't move. Her hands rested on the polished wood of the defense table, fingertips pressing down, as if trying to anchor herself to something tangible. Her reflection wavered on the glossy surface, but she did not recognize the woman staring back at her, This was supposed to be the moment of relief. She was not going to prison. She was not walking out of this building in cuffs. The world had seen her at her lowest, had debated over her, dissected her, stripped her of the identity she had spent years crafting. And yet, she was still here, But the question that clawed at the back of her mind was brutal in its simplicity. Now what? For so long she had fought. Fought to be heard. Fought to be seen. Fought for the things she believed in, even when it meant standing alone. And yet, in the span of a few days, that fight had turned against her. It had swallowed her whole, chewed through the certainty she once carried in her bones, and spat her back out into a world that no longer looked the same. She had spent years believing that she knew exactly who she was. Now, she wasn't so sure anymore. A voice cut through the silence, grounding her. "You look like you're deciding whether to walk out or disappear into the floor." Lillian inhaled sharply, the familiarity of the voice settling in her chest like a weight. She turned. Thomas Ainsworth stood in the doorway. His posture was as rigid as ever, shoulders squared, the disciplined stance of a man who had spent his life abiding by rules that had never been meant to bend. But there was something different now. A looseness at the edges, a shift in the air between them that had not existed before, For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lillian let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I thought you'd left." Thomas stepped inside, his boots quiet against the polished floor. "I could say the same to you." She let out a hollow laugh, but there was no humor in it. The truth was, she didn't know why she was still standing here. Perhaps because leaving meant facing a world that would never let her forget. Perhaps because this room, this awful, suffocating place, felt like the last space where she was still trapped in the moment before everything changed. He studied her for a long moment. Then, he said something she did not expect. "You could have won." Lillian frowned, thrown by the statement. She scoffed, shaking her head. "Won? I don't think anyone wins in situations like these." But Thomas held her gaze, unwavering. "No. I mean, you could have fought harder. You could have refused to take responsibility. You could have played the victim." A pause. "But you didn't." She swallowed hard. Something in her wanted to argue, to say that she hadn't been given a chance, that the world had made up its mind before she even stepped foot in this courtroom. But deep down, she knew he was right. She had made a choice. Not in the moment she threw that punch, that had been impulsive, reckless. That had been rage speaking before reason could catch up, No, her real choice had come later. When she stopped fighting for the sake of fighting. When she had finally let herself face the truth. She wasn't a martyr. She wasn't a hero. She was just a person who had let anger drive her, who had allowed herself to believe that her cause excused her actions. She had been wrong. And the moment she accepted that, the battle had changed. She met Thomas's gaze, and for the first time, there was no animosity there. No resentment. No lingering tension of an unresolved war. Only understanding. Lillian let out a slow, unsteady breath. "So what now?" she asked, not sure if she was directing the question at him or at herself. Thomas studied her for a moment longer, then glanced toward the open courtroom doors. "Now," he said, "you walk out of here, and figure out who you are outside of this." She let the words settle over her. They felt strange, final, yet not an ending, because he was right. This was not the conclusion. This was the part where she had to decide who she would become after everything. Lillian glanced at the doors, the threshold between past and future. Between who she had been and who she had to be next, She exhaled. Then, finally, she walked forward,